In anthropology and geography, a cultural region, cultural sphere, cultural area. A cultural area refers to a geographical area with one relatively homogeneous human activity, a complex of activities. These are often associated with an ethnolinguistic group and the territory it inhabits. Specific cultures often do not limit their geographic coverage to the borders of a nation-state, or to smaller subdivisions of a state. Cultural spheres of influence may also overlap or form concentric structures of macrocultures encompassing smaller local cultures. Different boundaries may also be drawn depending on the particular aspect of interest, such as religion and folklore versus dress and architecture versus language. Cultural areas are not considered equivalent to culture. History of the concept. A cultural area is a concept in cultural anthropology, in which a geographic region and time sequence is characterized by substantially uniform environment and culture. The concept of culture or areas was originated by museum curators and ethnologists during the late 1800s as means of arranging exhibits. Clark Whistler and Alfred Kroeber further developed the concept on the premise that they represent long-standing cultural divisions. The concept is criticized by some, who argue that the basis for classification is arbitrary, but other researchers disagree, and the organization of human communities into cultural areas remains a common practice throughout the social sciences. The definition of culture or areas is enjoying a resurgence of practical and theoretical interest as social scientists conduct more research on processes of cultural globalization. Types. A formal culture region is an area inhabited by people who have one or more cultural traits in common, such as language, religion, or system of livelihood. It is an area relatively homogeneous with regard to one or more cultural traits. The geographer who identifies a formal culture region must locate cultural borders. Because cultures overlap and mix, such boundaries are rarely sharp, even if only a single cultural trait is mapped, so there are cultural border zones rather than lines. The zones broaden with each additional cultural trait that is considered, because no two traits have the same spatial distribution. As a result, instead of having clear borders, formal culture regions reveal a center core where the defining traits are all present. Away from the central core, the characteristics weaken and disappear. Thus, many formal culture regions display a core periphery, in contrast to the abstract cultural homogeneity of a formal culture region. A functional culture region may not be culturally homogeneous. Instead, it is an area that has been organized to function politically, socially, or economically as one unit. A city, an independent state, a precinct, a church, diocese, a parish, a trade area, or a farm. Functional culture regions have nodes or central points where the functions are coordinated and directed, such as city halls, national capitals, precinct voting places, parish churches, factories, and banks. In this sense, functional regions also possess a core periphery configuration, in common with formal culture regions. Many functional regions have clearly defined borders that include all land under the jurisdiction of a particular urban government, clearly delineated on a regional map by a line distinguishing between one jurisdiction and another. Vernacular, popular, or perceptual cultural regions are those perceived to exist by their inhabitants, as is evident by the widespread acceptance and use of a distinctive regional name. Some vernacular regions are based on physical environmental features, others find the basis in economic, political, or historical characteristics. Vernacular regions, like most culture regions, generally lack sharp borders, and the inhabitants of any given area may claim residence in more than one such region. It grows out of people's sense of belonging and identification with a particular region. An American example is Dixie. They often lack the organization necessarily for functional regions, although they may be centered on a single urban node. They frequently do not display the cultural homogeneity that characterizes formal regions. Alan Noble gave a summary of the concept of development of cultural regions using the terms cultural heart, cultural core, by Donald Mining for Mormon Culture, published in 1970, and source area by Fred Niffen and later Henry Glassy for house and barn types. Outside of a core area, he quoted Mining's use of the terms domain and sphere. Cultural boundary. A cultural boundary in ethnology is a geographical boundary between two identifiable ethnic or ethnolinguistic cultures. A language border is necessarily also a cultural border, but it can also divide subgroups of the same ethnolinguistic group along more subtle criteria, such as the Brunner-Genapf roost line in German-speaking Switzerland, the vice-versa equator in Germany, of the Grote Rivieran boundary between Dutch and Flemish culture. In the history of Europe, the major cultural boundaries are found in Western Europe between Latin Europe, where the legacy of the Roman Empire remained dominant, and Germanic Europe, where it was significantly syncretized with Germanic culture. In the Balkans, the Jurachek line, dividing the area of dominant Latin from that of dominant Greek influence. Macrocultures on a continental scale are also referred to as worlds, spheres, or civilizations, such as the Muslim world. In a modern context, a cultural boundary can also be a division between subcultures or classes within a given society, such as blue-collar versus white-collar, etc. See also, isogloss, role in conflict. Cultural boundaries sometimes define the difference between friend and foe in political and military conflicts. For example, many religious wars have been fought to forcibly convert people of a different religion, or to put more territory under control of leaders of a particular religion. Ethnic nationalism and pan-nationalism sometimes seek to unify all native speakers of a particular language, who are conceived of as a coherent ethnic group or nation, into a single nation-state with a unified culture. The association of an ethno-linguistic group with a nation-state may be written into nationality laws and repatriation laws, which establish eligibility for citizenship based on ethnicity rather than place of birth. In other cases, attempts have been made to divide countries based on cultural boundaries, through secession or partition. For example, the Quebec sovereignty movement seeks to separate French-speaking province from English-speaking Canada to preserve its Unkwe language and culture. The partition of India created separate majority Hindu and majority Muslim countries. Examples: East-West dichotomy, the notion of a Western civilization contrasting with both the Near East and the Far East. Language families: Slavic Europe, Germanic-speaking Europe, Latin America, Celtic Europe. Individual languages: Anglosphere, Francophonie, Hispanidad, Hispanic America, Ibero-America, Lussosphere, German language in Europe, Hindi Belt, Sinophone. Geographic: Northern England, Greater China, Greater India, Indosphere, Greater Iran, Nordic countries, Caribbean. Religious: Christendom, Muslim world, Confucian world. Music: a music area is a cultural area defined according to musical activity. It may or may not conflict with the cultural areas assigned to a given region. The world may be divided into three large music areas, each containing a cultivated or classical musics that are obviously its most complex musical forms, with nearby folk styles which interact with the cultivated, and on the perimeter, primitive styles. Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa based on shared isometric materials, diatonic scales, and polyphony based on parallel thirds, fourths, and 7/5, would usually use the natural major scale and minor scale and Dorian, Lydian and Mixolydian modes. North Africa, Southwest Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Indonesia and parts of Southern Europe, based on shared small intervals in scales, melodies, and polyphony, would usually use the harmonic minor scale and the Phrygian scale. American Indian, East Asia, Northern Siberian, and Finno-Ugric music based on shared large steps in pentatonic and tetratonic scales. However, he then adds that the worldwide development of music must have been a unified process in which all peoples participated, and that one finds similar tunes and traits in puzzlingly isolated or separated locations throughout the world. Bibliography: Philip V. Bowman, Marcello Sorsacella, and Laura Sazzaroni. Musical Anthropology of the Mediterranean. Interpretation, Performance, Identity. Bologna: Edizioni Club Cooperativa Libraria Universitaria Editrice, 2009. Marcello Sorsacella, Gebietsgeschichten und Klanglandschaften in den Alpen. Zum Gebrauch einiger historischer Begriff aus der Musikethnologie, in Nussbaumer, Volksmusik in den Alpen. Intercultural, Horizonte und Crossovers, Salzburg. Verlag Müller Speiser, 2006 pp.